Welcome to this iHeartMedia podcast. I'm Brian Main, along with Bob Reedmiller, sitting in for John Bagnasco. Tiger Palafox, this is Garden America. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you're a regular listener to our show every Saturday, thank you for tuning in. And thank you for tuning into this Facebook Live podcast, which will be uploaded next week, so you'll be able to listen to it again or catch any information you might have missed. Today's podcast is a little different. We're going to talk about orchids. And Bob, you've started out years ago with staghorn ferns and orchids. But you're more known now these days as kind of the cactus succulent guy. Well, let's talk about your background and then work our way into orchids.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, coming from back east, you have very limited growing season and the types of things that you can grow. And moved to Carlsbad, and you found out if you put up just a light, like a lath covering or something in your yard, you can grow pretty much anything you want, anything you can think of. And I remember seeing a staghorn fern someplace, and I thought, oh, that's pretty interesting, very strange, very bizarre.
Had you seen that growing up?
No.
Not at all.
No,
You're a New Jersey guy, right?
Yeah, this is like an alien plant, like it came from another planet. And they're still kind of that way if you look at them, really. And I got one, and one thing led to another, and before I knew it, I had a backyard business and was growing them to sell primarily twice a year down at the Carlsbad Street Fair, but I would sell them during the year also, just word of mouth.
I've seen them established. How do you get them going? How do you start?
Well, there's a lot of different ways, or I should say a lot of different ways, a couple of different ways. Usually by division is the easiest because they produce pups, other plants from the main mother plant. And you just go in there with a knife or in some of the big cases, great big old overgrown ones, people look at me like I'm crazy.
Yeah,
but you use a keyhole saw.
Yeah.
And you go in there and you just start sawing between the plants. And you pull them off, and then you can mount each one by themselves. If you want to do it for super quantity, but it's a little bit more fussy and difficult to do, is you grow them from spore, which is the fern's equivalent of seeds. And that's a little bit more involved, but I have done it, and it's really a fun, interesting thing to do if you have the patience, because it's not like you're going to get a plant overnight. It takes some time.
And so that's what spurred you into orchids?
A friend of mine, who used to live in Hawaii for a while, when he moved in, his parents lived next door to my parents. And he started, missed the orchids, and he got an orchid from someplace, and I didn't know where. And it turned out to be Solana orchids in Solana Beach. And so, I gave him staghorns, and we were kind of on this tropical plant cruise together,
Yeah.
And so we went down one time to Solana Orchids for him to buy another orchid, and then I got one. And as the years went on, I don't know what spurred me on to do it, but I decided I was going to see if I could get a job down there. And I already had a full-time job, so I was doing this strictly as a part-time job on the weekends. Mm-hmm. And Belle and Leo Garner were the owners, and became very good friends with them, and worked for them on Saturdays and Sundays for about 2.5 years, I guess.
Wow.
And I was strictly a mule. I mean, they would put me into these massive greenhouses, and they were growing orchids for cut flower. They were a cut flower nursery, basically selling to all the florists across the country. And so I would get in. She's put me into a greenhouse that was bench after bench after bench of hundreds of feet of benches of, say, Cattleya orchids in like 6-inch pots. And Cattleyas grow out. They walk along the surface. And then eventually they walk out of the pot, and then the roots come down and they attach themselves to the wooden benches, or they go down below the benches and whatever. It's quite interesting to see. So my job was to start in that corner and start pulling each one of them apart. You cut off and save the front growth, which is going to be repotted into a new pot. And then you take the back part. Maybe you might save some of the back pseudo bulbs or something for sale as bulbs or to replant. But just do that until you're done with that greenhouse. And so I'd be
You're
doing
talking
that.
about hundreds, right?
Oh, thousands.
Thousands. Oh.
And if it wasn't Cattleyas, then it would be Cymbidiums in the off season. And you would just keep going till you got done, and then you'd move to someplace else. And by then, of course, by the time you got done, the other stuff was already well rooted and on its way to walking out again probably next year.
So this could have done one or two things, having to do all this. You would have learned to hate orchids because of this work, or love them. And you loved them.
I loved them. They're such interesting plants, and they are so much easier to take care of than people realize. There are some that are difficult. There's no two ways about it. And they had some of those down there because, being that they were cut flower growers, they would have some of the really exotic ones. But those are in temperature-controlled greenhouses where they had the right humidity, the right temperature all year long. Some of the other ones, like especially the cymbidiums, but also epidendrums, they like a good chill off in the wintertime. Cymbidiums really have to have one to flower properly. And so those are perfectly suited to Southern California, outdoors or with just minor protection if need be. Even some of the cattleyas will do perfectly fine outdoors.
Yeah.
They just don't like a good hard freeze. They'll take a little nip of frost maybe.
I mentioned to you during the show we had this morning between breaks that I love orchids, but they don't always bloom. They go through these cycles. And I asked you, I said, could I buy several different orchids? And so I've always got one in bloom. And then your answer to that is?
Yes.
You can do that.
You can.
But you have to know what kind you're buying
You have to know what
the
kind.
Seasons.
Yep. Now, see, what's nice is with the cymbidiums, depending on the varieties, and there's thousands of different varieties now, which, by the way, if nobody knows, orchids are if I'm not mistaken, the only genus or family of plants or family of plants, I guess is what it is, that you can cross-hybridize among the different genera, the different genuses. So you can cross a Cattleya with an epidendrum. You can cross a Laelia with a Cattleya.
So there's no genetic block.
No. Well, there is the further out you get on the spectrum of orchids.
Okay.
So if you go to this one that's all the way on this end and this one that's all the way on that end, it ain't going to happen.
But everything in between.
But the closer you get, the more you can mix them up. Excuse me. And because of that, you get things like a Brassavola crossed with a Cattleya, which becomes a Brassocattleya. You cross that Brassocattleya with a Laelia, and you get a Laelio-Brassocattleya. And each time you're introducing different characteristics of the other plants, and you get some phenomenal flowers. I mean, just incredible colors and shapes and
sizes.
Patterns, sizes. Yeah. It goes on and on and on.
Sounds like a fun game. You take shots and then try to pronounce
Yeah,
the names.
well, and they get to a point, I think, where if you're up to like 5 genera in the cross, you get to give it a name that ends in ARA.
Okay.
So it could be Bryanara. You could just
a Bryanara.
A Bryanara, and then you would know that had these 5 parents in it.
Okay. Okay. Sure.
So, but back to your question, can you have them all year long? If you start with something like cymbidiums, which are really very tough, very forgiving, they have, depending on the variety, there's some that will start to bloom as early as September, but usually November is when they really start to kick in. I haven't talked this much, and I don't know how long.
You just choked up talking about orchids.
Yeah, but then the bloom season goes from primarily November through to May. You can even see now in the grocery stores, Albertsons or Vons or whatever, there's cymbidiums in there now. It's the time to get them. But first off, cymbidiums, when they bloom, they're in bloom. If you leave them on the plant, they're on the plant for 2 or 3 months.
Yeah.
Really?
Oh, yeah. A lot of orchids are long-lasting bloomers.
Long time.
Is this more the cymbidiums or?
Well, cymbidiums primarily.
Okay,
And if you buy them when they've got 3 or 4 flowers open on the spike, and you've got another 10 flowers to go, you're going to have that thing in bloom for a long time. So the key is to
look for the ones that haven't opened yet.
Yeah, a lot of buds.
How many buds does this have on it? So that's going to give me an idea of how long it's going to last.
But even the ones that are already open will still last a month, if not longer. So it's
I think I'm going to go to Trader Joe's today.
Yeah.
They got a bunch of them in there.
They do, yeah. And so that'll feed your orchid frenzy for at least several months if need be. Then the other one that's the most common one you see for people to purchase and have are the Phalaenopsis, which you've got the lovely plastic one
a
up
little
on the.
plastic Phalaenopsis.
It's been in bloom for at least 8 or 10 years now.
It's doing very well. It loves the fluorescent lighting.
It does. And Phalaenopsis are more of a greenhouse orchid because they don't like to get that cold. So it's not one that you would necessarily grow outdoors here.
Because is it that whole tropical thing going on?
Yeah, but what's good about them is that people think that they're so mysterious and so hard to take care of, and they're not.
No, but I can see why people would have that impression.
Yeah.
Like what is this? What does it do? How come it's not blooming? It's dead. No, it's not dead. It's going to go through a bloom cycle.
And what happens is, depending on the variety, because there's some varieties, they used to actually be a different class in the orchids. It was a Doritis crossed with a Phalaenopsis, and it was called a Doridonopsis, which grows more of an upright spike with branches, and they would tend to make bloom spikes more frequently. So while this one was going, another one was coming. And so by the time this one was finishing out, this one was getting ready to start again.
I gotcha. Okay.
So those were nice because they would pass that on. They've since, I think, lumped it into just calling them Phalaenopsis like all the other ones. But what happens is when you buy one of those from Trader Joe's or wherever it is, they're usually in a pot, and the roots are just wrapped with a bit of sphagnum moss.
Or just bark.
Just bark. Yeah, I've seen that.
And the just bark is better.
Yeah.
The sphagnum moss they found is good for the commercial marketing of them because it holds some moisture in there. In a grocery store, you can't go around watering plants. You can't get water on the floor. People slipping in them. And
so this is how they keep the moisture in there.
Yeah, they're just not set up to do it. But the orchids will be fine with just a little slurp into that pot every now and then, and the moss stays damp. And they'll stay in their bloom. And again, Phalaenopsis, it's another one. 2, 3, 4 months in bloom, depending on how well you're taking care of it and when it started to bloom.
What's your favorite color of orchid?
Gosh,
I'll tell you what fascinates me: black orchid.
Well, there's a couple that are really close, and those are again a little bit more in the exotic side. And for the life of me, I can't think of his name.
And they're not a true black, right?
No, but they are so close. They're a dark mahogany purple brown.
It's like the roses.
Yeah,
they're not quite, but almost gothic looking.
Yeah, absolutely. Who is Fred? Is Fred Clark?
For what?
From the flower fields in Carlsbad. He's also an orchid breeder. I think it's Fred Clark. That's one of his venues that he goes into is breeding these really dark colored orchids, but they're odd genera like Catasetum and I can't think of some of the others right now. But so yeah, black is cool. Mine I kind of like. There's some really beautiful Cattleyas in yellows and oranges, reds.
I love red.
Which are kind of unusual. And again, that's another thing too. If you have to kind of do your homework. Cattleyas, like I said, the white ones, the pink ones, the lavender ones, they'll handle outdoors in Southern California, coastal, fairly well. They will take a light chill if need be. But when you get into some of the more exotic colors of Cattleyas, like yellows and oranges and reds, they don't like it. And they're a little bit harder to keep alive. I've killed several oranges and yellows, doing my best, but just no.
All right, well, let's talk about the care.
Yeah,
let's watering, because it's not.
Well, that's what I was going to say. When you get the ones, from if you buy a Cymbidium in the grocery store or whatever, they're good to go. You put them outside.
Well, let's make it easy. Let's take orchids and group in Cymbidium, Phalaenopsis, phylums, and Cattleyas. Epidendrums and Cattleyas.
They just need a host.
Right.
No.
Well,
He said epiphyte, meaning epidendrum.
Epidendrum.
Gotcha.
And then
with you.
The Cattleyas. So these are kind of common ones that you find.
Right.
And let's make them so they're inside. Let's not get into the outside plants, kind of for our listeners, and say, okay, you got these, you went and bought them at a store, you went and bought them at a nursery, grocery store, florist shop, and you got it home. It's in bloom. You have to take care of it. Now, you're going to want to put it in a room with good light, but it doesn't need direct sun.
Right.
So it needs a room with windows for sure.
Okay.
Not an artificial light. It needs windows. It needs some good natural light. Watering, like you say, a lot of them, they're in either a bark or they're in a sphagnum moss. Some of them you might find in some kind of soil. They need to be draining. So when you do water, the water needs to go away from the plant.
Yep.
That's really important. As far as watering goes, you're probably looking at 10 days to 2 weeks in between watering.
Again, depending on which one it is.
Right.
Because cymbidiums typically are grown in more of a soil type mix.
Right.
Heavier mix. So you water that really well, and they've got these really big pseudo bulbs that are water storage parts. So they get a good drink, and at least a week, 2 weeks, maybe they're perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Things like the Phalaenopsis, they don't have the pseudo bulbs. They just have their roots.
Right.
That's it. They probably should get watered once a week.
Right.
And let the water run through really well. And I started to get to it, but we didn't finish. The ones that are come wrapped in the sphagnum, they really need to be repotted if you want to
Continue
extend
to have
them
it.
and grow them on, because that's not going to do it for them.
Right.
If you want to get the most out of them, get the good growth.
Yeah.
So there's your kind of watering schedule. And you're trying to keep the bloom going, but eventually it will stop.
Everybody wants it to look like the day they bought it.
Right. And then you kind of go into the next step, fertilization. How do you take care of these? You mentioned a lot of these are in bark or very well draining soil, which doesn't retain a lot of nutrients.
Right.
So you usually use a water soluble fertilizer.
Yeah. You water them with a liquid fertilizer.
Yeah.
Or you can use something like Osmocote or these tablets, Agriform tablets or something like that, which slowly they'll hold their place in the bark. They won't just flush through.
Yeah.
And will release little by little. But usually it's a water-soluble liquid drink that you're going to give them.
If you go to a garden center, you're going to see a shelf. And it's going to have orchid fertilizer on there. And it's going to have a whole series of different ones for different orchids, different times a year, which is good for an ideal thing.
It can make it a little nuts.
It can, but I think, Bob, you'd agree that, just giving them a little nutrients is all they really need.
And a good balanced fertilizer works out fine. Just, 10-10-10 or something like that.
So this is a plant that you could do a little too much and hurt it.
Well, too much water, too much fertilizer can definitely hurt it for sure. And, one of the things I'm going to tell people, too, is that if they do want them to rebloom, though, they do have to take care of them because, as we mentioned, this soil that they're in and this air that they're in, this medium that they're in, doesn't have nutrients. And the plants have been grown in a hothouse. They've been grown in an ideal environment. They've been giving all the nutrients they need for their life.
They're used to tender, loving care.
Exactly. And if you stop giving them that care, they're going to regress a little bit. They're not going to bloom as quickly. They're not going to maybe, and it's funny because a lot of people love to see that deep green foliage, and a lot of times that's incorrect. They should have a lime green color to it. It should be
especially the cymbidiums.
Yeah, they should be a little pale.
Cymbidiums should basically, if you have the place to do it, if you're growing them seriously, they should be out almost full sun. If you can handle it, from spring until September. And it makes the foliage look really crappy. It's yellow, and it might be even sunburned a little bit.
Yeah, a lot of black spots.
But it'll bloom its head off. If you keep them in the shade, you get this nice, lush, grassy, flowing plants, and you won't get a flower spike.
Yeah.
So it's that simple.
So if you have the combination of both, if you can do that, sun, shade.
Yeah, they'll love it.
Yeah.
They'll love it.
And then as soon as typically what happens is when the temperatures start to drop in September, usually, that drop in temperature is what initiates the flower spike for the cymbidiums. And so you'll start to see them coming up alongside the pseudobulbs. It's a different kind of growth, so you recognize what it is.
Tiger, you mentioned, you go to a nursery like yours or Mission Hills, whatever. So you've got this orchid display, different orchids. Do they come with instructions? If I picked up an orchid, it would tell me exactly how to care for this orchid.
An orchid display. I mean, you would hope the tag would have something, but a lot of times they don't have good informational tags. They
Sometimes
usually
it'll
just have a
say
name.
water once a week or something.
Yeah.
Because you might have two orchids that need different care.
But if you go up to where the fertilizers are, they usually on the fertilizer they tell you
tell
exactly what orchid this is for,
Okay.
when it should be used, how much you should use it, and that's really good information.
Yeah.
One
of the real common ones you'll find is Peter's
right
orchid fertilizer. There's one that's decidedly pink and one decidedly blue.
Yeah.
And one is a bloom fertilizer. The other one's a growth fertilizer.
So would it be a good idea for me to take this orchid that I have now that just it's got 3 or 4 green leaves, and there's one that is kind of a lemon color, kind of a little pale color. Would it do me good to take it outside today in the full sun?
No. It's a Phalaenopsis.
I see somebody
Looks like that one up there.
Somebody gave it to me. I've never seen it in bloom.
But it has the strap leaves
I mean,
like that.
I would say no for sure in general, just because it's been grown in an environment. You take it outside, it's gonna
burn
for
for
it. Being in all winter than getting the sunburn.
It needs to be adapted for it. And I mean, they can tolerate it, but if it's a Phalaenopsis, like Bob's saying, that shouldn't go outside at all. Only Cymbidiums and
under the eave.
Under the eaves, it'd be fine.
It's not getting any
if it gets
sun,
bright indirect, reflected
indirect light,
that's fine.
Okay, that's good. That's good to know.
But what's probably holding it back from blooming more than anything, and again, not knowing what kind it is.
And I just got it from somebody a month ago.
Yeah, it's kind of sketchy, but it is the watering, because they have no means of storing water. So you've got to be on the spot with making sure it gets watered once a week.
Yeah.
And let it run through really good.
What about the ice cube theory? A couple of ice cubes on.
That does work. I've done it.
Kind of let it just kind of slowly.
Yeah, because
it's keeping it moist.
Yeah,
right?
it keeps it moist.
Yeah.
Sometimes you run the risk of rotting, things like that. But it's not bad.
It's not a bad thing to do in a pinch. But a good, healthy watering is the best thing you can do.
Hey, we're going to wrap this up. A lot of great information, Bob. Thank you. I'm a little further ahead in my orchid knowledge.
Can we make one more recommendation?
Yes, absolutely, please.
I found with the Phalaenopsis, usually if I get one from the store, actually a friend of mine from the nursery, her husband brings her one every time the last one goes out of bloom. And that's the way we treat orchids now. It's like cut flower.
Cut flowers, yeah.
They buy one because they're so cheap now. They used to be one of the most expensive plants in the world you could buy. And now $9 you got an orchid.
Yeah.
So she'll have it in the house and it blooms for 2 months or 3 months or something, finishes blooming, throw it out, and he brings home a new one. Well, they started giving me all of their toss-outs, and I would just repot them. And I finally got to a point where I had to just say, no, I'm not going to do this anymore, because I had almost no desk, space left in my bedroom, because I'm working on the computer, and this whole side is orchids, But they were blooming like crazy. But what I did find out, what really helps, there's a lot of different, what kind of soil mixes you use, for any plant. That people have their choices and whatever. One of the things I found that works really incredibly well for the Phalaenopsis is the coconut coir.
Oh, good.
Which you can buy online in different grades of sizes of chunks or whatever.
Chunky.
And you soak it for 24 hours at least before you use it, because otherwise water just rolls off of it.
Right.
But use that, and the Phalaenopsis love it, and they just grow like crazy. And it was like they'd get in there, and within a month, there's a new spike coming up. And so it had flowers all over the place. So
awesome.
If you're going to repot, try the coconut coir.
All right.
All right.
Bob, thank you. Glad you're here filling in for John today, and we had a chance to do this
pleasure.
podcast talking about orchids. And thank you for watching us live on Facebook. And again, if you want to see, or not see, but if you want to hear this podcast, it will be uploaded this coming week, and it'll be on the iHeart platform. If you've been there before, you know what I'm talking about. Bob, thank you again for filling in. Good to see Tiger. John is back next week. Until then, thank you for tuning in to this iHeart Garden America podcast, and we'll see you next time back on the radio and on Facebook. Take care. Thank you.